Hey guys, just wanted to give you a heads up at the moment. I'm talking to Keith Banks, and one of the things, but we're having a little bit of audio is great. We're having a little bit of visual problem here, and the screen is freezing up every now and then. So forgive that, but you hear everything that's going on, and if it freezes, you just get to look at Keith's wonderful face in like a portrait position. So you get that benefit. What can I say?
I'll just have to be careful about the face I'm pulling at the moment, I think.
And we were just talking about how brilliant we both are as chefs these days and our love for cooking food. And me, I'm limited to my pressure cooker, but mate, you're the expert on the roast. Is that what the
Oh, I'm
story?
just, yeah, I'm getting there, mate. I'm getting there. Slow cooked lamb today. I absolutely love a good roast pork in a Weber.
Yep.
A Weber's changed my life as far as cooking's concerned. So, and I never would have thought, God, 30 years ago, I'd be having this conversation.
No, me too. My life for so long was you'd be driving home from gigs at 3 or 4 in the morning, and you just went for the standard toasted ham, cheese, and tomato. That was it at the servo,
Yeah,
because you
yeah,
could get
I hear.
toasted sandwiches at the servo back then.
I hear. Yep.
You never went for the chicken roll because a few occasions we got the chicken
Ooh.
roll and the chicken looked green, and we're like, oh gee,
Yeah, I
don't know
think, yeah,
how that's been sitting there for.
yeah, you're
Mate,
dicing with death there.
mate, you have an amazing story to tell. Really keen to get you to share it with people. Um, I was talking a while ago, a few weeks ago, with a mate of mine, Todd McGuire, who was a copper, did a lot of undercover work, and he's written a book just recently talking about the mental journey and the blackness surrounding his journey as a copper. Mate, you of course were one of Queensland's most decorated police officers. And these days, you're doing a lot of work in men's mental health and mental health in general, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, mate, I advocate for mental health discussions. I'm very fortunate since shameless marketing plug, Nick. Since I've had 2 books published, they've given me an opportunity to talk about mental health, to corporations. I do a fair bit of keynote speaking. Um, and I started all with just a simple sentence. Everybody in this room has trauma. Every single person has a degree of trauma, whether it's from childhood, work, relationship, witnessing something tragic, being part of something tragic. Who the hell knows? But you all have trauma. Um, and for too long, and I know you're in furious agreement, but for too long, men have not felt that they could admit that they were struggling. You know, we're programmed, certainly my generation and probably yours as well. We're programmed to be tough providers, husbands, fathers, partners, and be the stoic, tough guy. And that's why I think there's the suicide rates amongst men is just out of control. So I talk about mental health every opportunity I have, and my advocacy is to make it part of everyday normal conversation. So the same as breaking your femur or breaking your tibia, you go to the hospital, you put it in plaster. A mental health concern is an injury to the brain, and once you understand that the injury to the brain can be fixed, and it's actually an injury rather than I'm just a bit strange and maybe I won't tell anybody because they'll judge me because I'm having all of these bad thoughts. Once you understand that, then you can take the next step on the path to recovery. And recovery is definitely possible. The first part is to converse around it.
And mate, it's probably today is a very important day to be talking about this because
Mm,
we're the day after we're chatting the day after the Bondi shooting. We really have a nation in trauma in many ways,
yep,
and
yep.
I've already heard some personal stories of people really struggling with some issues, and but there was an interesting mix of messages coming out of that thing yesterday. Not only of the horror of what happened with the shootings, but also, I'm sorry, you know his name, the guy who took the gun off the fella.
Ahmed El Ahmed. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, it's
Yep.
an amazing story of courage, and also,
Mm,
you know, as people want to jump and blame this religious group or that religious group or whatever, here we see someone who's not a typical Aussie white Australian dude.
yeah.
Stepping up as the hero, it's a real mixed bag of messages for people to deal with. Mate, what's your take on where we're at?
Yeah, I agree, mate. Look, I think this has been coming, unfortunately, for a couple of years. And, we see particularly, I live in Melbourne. So
Mm.
we've had protests every weekend with people chanting Intifada, River to the Sea, Death to Israel, all of that stuff for 2 years. And everyone has a right to free speech, I believe. But when you're chanting for the death of a race of people, and nothing's being done, it it empowers you to do whatever you feel that you should. I'm not suggesting that these 2 would listen to the protests in Melbourne, but it's part of a wider societal move, I think,
Well, I
and,
think when you on the balance of that too, when you add that to the fact that people are seeing horror images of what's happening over in the Middle East day and day after day, you got these
yeah.
2 sides compounding and building up into this pressure cooker
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
that
yeah.
we're totally really disconnected to. And I think I heard an interview this morning with, Michael Vaughan, the English former, cricket captain, and, Piers Morgan. And Michael was saying, "Look, the real thing here is that everyone comes to Australia knowing it's such a safe place to come to, and that there are all these mixes of cultures and everything, and there's it's compared to most places in the world, safe. The fact this has happened is like a trauma to the nation, and now we've got to be on the lookout for each other on how we get our way through this, and Aussies will pick themselves up and get things back on track. But I think the things you're talking about within that mental health space is very relevant now to so many people.
Yeah, I agree, mate, and I make the point about the Melbourne situation simply because the impact it's had on most Melburnians over that period of time has been quite dangerous and quite traumatic. You know, people have not gone into the city because they're worried about being caught up in violent protests, etc. So, with that, and I certainly struggled with it yesterday as well, given some gun battles I've been in over my police career and other things I've done. I was watching that last night, and I had a mixture of, anger, incredible sadness, and I'll use the word trauma, because I just looked at it and thought those poor people are having a great day, regardless of religious belief. I'm not a particularly religious guy, but regardless of religious belief, we should be allowed to go to the beach without people and, climb a climbing wall and buy hot dogs, or and suddenly it's all changed. So the impact that's had on a lot of people, um, it needs to people need to manage their response. I thought back to it was about 20 years ago, the Cronulla riots happened in Bondi and Cronulla, and that was, predominantly white young men fueled up with rage about certain things that had been happening by some Lebanese offenders, and I'll just, leave it there.
Yeah.
And suddenly there were riots, and people were being subjected to massive violence because the whole mob mentality took over. I think what the New South Wales Police Commissioner and the Premier Minns said today is pretty powerful, and that is, we just need to take our time and we need to assess this, and we just need to make sure that we're not looking for retribution. What we need to look for is justice, absolutely.
I th
Um,
One of
but
the
it's
things
just a
sorry.
traumatic day. You're right, mate.
One of the things I think is different in this case, you look at the Cronulla riots, and it's been a very Australian thing that you go back to the Eureka Stockade, for example, which is probably the closest we came to a civil war in certain ways. It kind of lasted for a few hours, and then it was like, well, let's go have a barbie and a beer type of thing. Cronulla riots, you had a couple of days of coverage of it, really, and then things did settle down. And we do have this thing in Australia of not carrying things on and on and on. I think the trouble with this one is because so much of this is tied into an international situation, it does have
Mm.
the potential to carry on a lot longer and be fueled a lot longer from external forces. And I think as Australians, it's one of those times where we need to sit back and think, you really have clear thoughts about what do we see Australia as being, who are we, and what are our expectations of each other. And I think that's one of the first times we've really had to sit down en masse and do that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. This is we haven't had a mass shooting since Port Arthur. When was
Mhm.
that? 97.
Yeah.
So that the fact that this is a mass shooting creates a massive scar on the Australian psyche as well. This isn't just blokes punching on a
Yeah.
beach. This is wantonly and indiscriminately shooting people.
And the fact it's
So
tied to an international situation that's ongoing
yeah,
and to go
yeah,
on. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Mate, so your whole position on dealing with trauma and mental illness, we clearly goes back to your days as a copper.
Mm.
Mate, you went in at 17, did you? You started a police force?
Yeah, I joined the year I turned 17. So in those days, mate, it was a cadet system. So I
Yeah.
was in the
And
academy. I was
You're a
doing
Queensland born and bred boy?
Queensland born and bred. Oh, born in Sydney, but grew up in Queensland.
Okay, so
Um,
these census came up here. There you go.
with my mum. Um, And there's a whole 'nother story there, but there was a divorce early in my life, and, I came to Queensland with her, back to her
Mhm.
folks. So I grew up in the bush, with those really nice, good old-fashioned values
Yep.
that bush people tend to have,
Which where at? Which town was that?
Little place called Tambo near Charleville, between,
Okay. Yep.
Charleville and, sorry, between Augathella and Blackall.
Yeah,
About
right.
300 people in the town.
Yep.
So, lived there for a while. My mum remarried, not a very pleasant person, so, uh, a guy who drank too much, and, there's a lot of domestic abuse in my
Yeah.
childhood from that point on. So we moved around the state a fair bit where work was and so on. Um, and I left, the year I turned 17 as an escape, but also because I wanted to do something that legitimately and genuinely could help others.
Right.
Certainly didn't join for the salary.
Yeah.
Um, so went to the academy, did year 12 and then another 12 months of training after that. And then I had to wait until I turned 19. So I was sworn in as a cop, doing the usual uniform, walking the beat, etc. So 19, way too young, I think.
Yep.
And, all the friends I went to the academy with who stayed in the cops did their 42, 43 years or whatever. We all pretty much agree with that, I reckon.
Yep.
Um, but
How
then
do you
about,
when you're
uh,
18 or 19, how do you walk into a domestic violence situation and try and kind of deal with that when you
mm,
haven't started living yourself?
well, yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I'd seen domestic violence, sadly. So it actually created an anger in me
Right.
that other colleagues of mine didn't have. And I'm not proud of it, but, I'd certainly wreak some summary justice on men who were beating their wives and drag them out of the house and lock them up.
Mm.
Um, but did all that, loved all that uniform general duty stuff, because it was exciting. It was police work, we were locking up the bad guys and being cops. Because Brisbane, even in those days in the late 70s, excuse me, was a fairly violent city.
Mm.
Not everywhere, but there were pockets of violent behaviour, and trying to punch a cop in the head was probably Friday night entertainment in the centre of the city, so they were
Yep.
interesting times.
And the Valley was an
Um,
interesting place back in those days?
oh, God, yeah. Yeah, the Valley, that all came out years later, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, the corruption and so on. So, and that's the thing, Nick, I joined the police force in an era of corruption.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the full extent of it, but we knew it was there. And it was funny. People have asked me for years, how did you cope with it? And you go, well, it's like, it's just a darkness or a stain. You know it's there, so you do your best to ignore it.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of police I worked with, men and women, were good, straight, honest, fantastic
So you
people.
could do your job without getting pulled into that. It wasn't
Yeah,
you were forced to be drawn into that.
initially until I started working in the drug field. Yeah,
Okay.
you know.
Right.
Um, so I volunteered for deep undercover work just before I turned 22. I went into that.
Mm. So, but
You know,
what was that decision?
excuse
What
me.
what was that decision like?
Um,
How well was your knowledge of what it was about?
Yeah, two good questions, mate. The first, ideology, really. I wanted to do something that would fight the heroin trade. I wanted to contribute to something.
Mhm.
I wanted to change the world, like every young man does, I guess. But at that stage, heroin was flooding into the country. It was through the Mr. Asia syndicate in the late 70s, and then various crime syndicates in the 80s. And we had people dying almost every day. Almost every day as a uniform cop, you go to an OD, drag someone out of a public toilet or, a house or a flat or whatever who'd OD. Um, and I regarded heroin as an evil, evil drug, and the people who sold it as evil people. So I wanted to do something fair dinkum that could really contribute to locking them up. And undercover, and one of the other things, I'd be lying if I didn't admit this, but working undercover, you could dress how you wanted, you could grow your hair, put an earring in, and just absolutely not have to abide by the rules
Be the
of dress and
rebel.
appearance. Well, yeah, but well, see, in those days, it's hard for people who are younger to understand this, but cops were not allowed to grow beards.
Yeah, right.
The only cops you saw with a beard were those who had a medical certificate about, I don't know, shaving rash or something. Um, so they couldn't grow beards. There was a fairly, I don't know, army attitude towards haircuts.
Yep.
And I'd had 2 years in the academy with my hair all cut off, so, you know, that was part of it, to be honest. But, I didn't really excuse me, I didn't really understand what it involved. Um, I didn't know any undercover guys, but I just was fueled by this. I want to do something different attitude. Um, at that stage, I didn't drink, never had a beer in my life, didn't smoke cigarettes, um, did nothing. I was training in martial arts 4 or 5 days a week. I was running, you know. I was a bit holier than thou when it came to health and so on. You know, and when I was working undercover, within, I don't know, 3 months, I was drinking scotch and dry, like it was water.
Yeah.
I was having the occasional cigarette when I was in a pub. I was smoking dope with some targets I was buying from, and just had an entire change of lifestyle, I
So
guess.
you were hanging out with the musicians a lot?
No, I wasn't, because musicians weren't dealing in my world anyway.
Yeah, no.
Um, so what it was, mate, was, we had assumed identities. I was undercover for 2 years, so I had, I think, 3 or 4, maybe 4 assumed identities,
Mhm.
with driver's licenses, and there was no methodology to it. We were just encouraged to go and create our own identity. So you could type up a false driver's license, because in those days there were cardboard licenses, there were no photographs.
Yeah.
So you could type up any name you wanted and then take that to a bank and open a bank account. You know, there's no 100 points of proof in those days. Um, I'd take that to a rental company and rent, I don't know, a little TV or something, so I have rental papers in my assumed name. Um, didn't have credit cards in those days, that came later. But I just created this whole raft of identity that would sit in a wallet. So I had 4 different wallets, and each one had its own little identification things in there, that if anybody ever took a wallet off me and tried to suss out what was going on, they'd actually get the false name. Um, and that was one, but there was no training course. We were just basically thrown into the deep water and told to paddle. So I had to go and learn about drugs. I'd never smoked a joint in my life. And I certainly didn't know how to score, you know. So I made some bloody mistakes in the start, of course, and people were sus on me. But once I learnt about, street smarts as far as the drug scene was concerned, how to score, what weights I was after, what the pricing was, I started moving into buying a lot of heroin, and that became my expertise, I guess. You know, for maybe, mm, 12 or 14 months, I was just doing predominantly heroin jobs, just buying smack. And what undercovers did in those days was we go and buy drugs. The drugs we come back to where we were living, and excuse me, where we were living, write notes about conversations that we'd had, write notes of, I handed him 4 $50 notes and 20 $10 notes, whatever it was. Write it all down in the form of a court, in the form of notes that would be used later to write a court statement. Then seal the drugs in an envelope, sign across the seal, sticky tape it all down. So it was all legitimate chain of evidence stuff.
Yeah.
The problem was, if you were working outside the metropolitan area, you know, we often worked one out, so we're just by ourselves. Um, you'd rent an apartment somewhere or a unit somewhere, or sometimes a caravan I was living in, and you'd have to find somewhere in there to hide the drugs, and then make sure. Excuse me, just got a little bug in my throat.
Mm. Hey, quick commercial break. Big shout out to our sponsor for today's episode, which is me, Nik Phiilips. Look, I've got to thank myself so much. I couldn't be doing the show without me. And if you get a chance, check out the sponsor's website, www.nickphillips.com. Check out my music, my videos, my bio, all that stuff, and maybe contact me and book me for a gig. That would be great. But thanks, Nick, for your sponsorship. Back to the show.
And then make sure that, that was free, or pretty hard to find, basically. Because the thing about working undercover is there's a lot of risk. One of the risks is you get recognized as a copper.
Yep.
You'll get a bad belting. Probably wouldn't kill you, but they'd certainly beat the crap out of you. Um, or someone from your past would recognize you and call you by your right name when you're using another name. Same result. You've got to talk your way out of that. That happened a couple of times. But the big thing for us, and I say us, there were 5 of us in those days, all young men, no women. The oldest of us was 25, I think. So we're all kids, right? The biggest risk that we had was getting ripped off. because we always carried a shitload of cash,
Yep.
and in the drug see, I'm not suggesting you know, but you've probably heard stories. In the drug world, people know you've got cash, you're a target.
Yep.
So we had to learn to um, have this attitude of, don't fuck with me. And
Yep.
I was lucky to be 70 kilos ringing wet in those days. And I was a martial artist. I could certainly look after myself, but it was more about developing an air of menace. Little guys, you look at a little guy who's got confidence and air of menace, you're going to go, I don't think I'm going to mess around with him.
Yep.
I'm just going to leave him alone for a while. So on top of that, I carried a gun most times, but the police standard pistol in those days was a 3-inch barrel revolver, a Smith& and Wesson revolver. But we had access to the firearms section, and I charmed the guy who was in charge of the firearms section because I used to be a charming little guy, and and I'd rock up there, hide, sneak my way into police headquarters and sneak up all the back stairs, and I'd go in there probably once every 2 months, maybe less. And he'd say, "Okay, mate, you're back. These are all the guns that have come in from the crooks that have been seized." So I'd look at them all and go, "I'll have that one and that one and that
Mm.
one and maybe that one." So I was carrying I had guns galore. And as someone wrote an article about my first book, a pretty well-known crime reporter in Melbourne, and I had a chat with him about it, and he quoted me, and I think my quote was something like, you know, um, "Heaps of cash, unlimited access to guns and drugs, no supervision. What could possibly go wrong?"
Did the dealers and that, did they know you were carrying?
Not often because I had carried a little tiny 25 caliber semi-automatic pistol, about
Mm.
6 or 7 rounds, I think, that could fit in your jocks or fit down your boot or wrap it up in a handkerchief and put it in the front pocket of your jeans, just as a bit of, I suppose, a security blanket.
Yep.
But there were a couple of times where when I learned my trade and I was a little bit older, and I went back to undercover when I was, God, they dragged me in when I was a detective sergeant, I think, to do an undercover job on the coast.
Mm.
So when I was doing other jobs, one-off jobs, there was one meeting I had where a guy produced a 9mm pistol, which is pretty shitty, really, and just tried to impress me, put it on the table. So I reached in the back of my jeans, pulled mine out, and he said, "Oh man, can I buy that off you?" I went, "No, fuck you, man. No, get your own." So sometimes that happened, but it was
And
more
so
like a sense of security, I suppose.
yeah. I was talking to, a guy, Todd McGuire, a few weeks ago about his undercover world, and he tells this one story about where he was at a bikies club in around the Wynnum Way, around the bay down Bayside in Brizzy. And, he was a football player. He actually played for Australia in the Australian police football team,
Whoa.
and,
Yep.
he played for Tugun also, in first grade.
Uh,
And, one of the guys there recognised him. He played at Tugun and said, aren't you Toddy?" He said, "No, mate. No, I'm Donny." Said, didn't you play for Tugun?" "No, no, from Sydney, mate. Never don't know what you're talking about." It went on and on. He said he ended up just punching this guy and knocking him out. And,
yeah.
said a while later, the guy's brother and a couple of their mates came in with a shotty and put the shotty in his face and, started questioning him. And he found out later on they were winding him up. But, he was like, he said you were a cop, mate." He said, "Yeah, I am a cop. Detective Donny. Now turn around and put your hands together." And they all laughed and everything.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah,
did you have those
yeah.
situations where someone recognized
Um,
you in the corner?
yep, yep. I was gonna say there was another UC after my time that was nicknamed the Beast because he rarely showered and he played the whole street thing. Oh God, you couldn't stand to be in a room with him. Uh, but I listened to or I saw a transcript of a drug deal he made where these guys said, "I think you're a cop," and he said, "Yeah, I am. I am a cop. You got the right to remain silent. Fucking, you're under arrest. Ho 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 ho." Um, yeah, there was one in particular, I was after I finished my first stint in undercover, I went to Cairns with, an undercover guy, initially to be his controller or his handler,
Mhm.
and Larry and I've written about Larry, he was one of my best friends, sadly passed away a few years ago from blood cancer, and, he was up there and he was burned out. He'd been undercover for maybe 4 years, something like that, and on the way up, he said, "I can't do this alone, mate. I can't do it." I went, "Okay, I'll move in with you into a little unit. We'll work together." So I fell back into undercover then, and I shouldn't have been, but I was always a bit of a rebel. So we're scoring from we had a target list and, we'd meet them in pubs, ingratiate our way into the scene, score from their dealer, score from their dealer, and that sort of thing. And, and there was a guy that wasn't on the target list that we just met through a young prostitute who was living in the set of units where we were, near where we were, um, in near the Cairns Base Hospital, I think. And we just met her, chatted to her. She introduced us to this guy who was selling a fair bit of like pounds of dope. And, we went, okay, not just in bags, but pounds we'll certainly buy. So anyway, we're dealing with him and we're setting up £100 dope deal, which was a lot of weed and probably still is a lot of dope. And it was going to be, I think it was about $1,000 a pound. So yeah, $100,000 or around there. So anyway, he'd come over to our place, we'd have a drink, we'd laugh, we socialize because sometimes you just got to do that. And we're out with him one night at this disco in Cairns. For all the young people, there were these things called discos back in the 80s. Um, so we're in the playpen disco,
Yep.
and I'd grown
Get
my beard
open.
and
Yeah.
yeah, the old playpen,
The
and
big one.
yeah, yeah, it was a big one, and it was actually owned by a friend of mine, well, not a friend of mine, owned by a guy I'd gone to school with that I hadn't seen since year 8. This time I'm back, I've grown a big black beard, I've got my hair longer, got an earring in and thinking, I went to school in Cairns for like 4 years. No one will recognize me because of, just a different guy these days. Roll. Walked up to the bar with the target and my colleague, and Brett, who was the owner or the manager of the playpen, his old man owned it. He walked up and looked at me and went, "Hey, Keith." And my name was Jim at that stage. And I just looked at him and abused him and went, I don't know what you're talking about, wanker, give him like, 3 rum and cokes. And he persevered and he said, "Keith, it is you, isn't it?" And I just remember giving him a mouthful and, calling him all the names under the sun and just saying, fucking either give us a rum and cokes or I'll come over there and sort you out, that sort of shit. And I remember I turned and looked at the target. And the best analogy, if you've ever seen photographs of Charles Manson, the guy in LA in the
Beautiful.
60s, those black, soulless, evil eyes, that's what his were like. And I remember looking and going, "Whoa, fuck. I've seen into this guy's soul and he doesn't have one." It was that scary.
Yeah.
And, anyway, I went back to the table and the whole mood had changed. And I was thinking, wow. And he was only a little guy. So air of menace, right?
Yep.
So mood changed. He went back to where he was living. We parted ways. And I went into the playpen the next afternoon, snuck in and said, "Look, I need to talk to Brett." Brett came out and I said, "Mate, you're right, it is me." So I told him what was going on. And I said, "Mate, I'm literally putting my safety in your hands here, but, I need your help." And he came up with the idea of, he said, "Look, bring the guy back in the night after next. Um, I'll fawn all over you. I'll give you free drinks. I'll apologize profusely and see how that goes," which is what we did. And went back in and it worked. It worked beautifully because, a lot of crooks and dealers have a massive ego and they like to be the center of attention. And this guy did. Anyway, it turns out it's a bit of a longer story, but in essence, when the operation closed, he bolted. He must have had a sixth sense of what was going on and he did a runner.
Mhm.
And he was arrested in Brisbane maybe 2 months later. But when he was arrested, it transpired that he was using a false name as well,
Mhm.
that he was an escapee from Yatala prison in Adelaide. He was doing life sentence for a double murder. He'd been a member of the Gypsy Jokers outlaw motorcycle gang. And he admitted all that. He said, "Yeah, you got me." And pretty affable guy. And he said during the interview, "Well, I was planning to kill Jim," which was my name. He was, 800 grand. I was going to nog him for it. And, all wouldn't be good. So the detectives came out and told me. And I just went, my first words were, "Fuck, I thought we were mates."
Yeah.
Like, and so the irony of it is I was lying to him, setting him up to go to jail. He was lying to
Right.
me,
Yeah.
setting me up to kill me,
Mate,
you
did you
know?
find you talked about there's a prostitute involved in that situation there, and I'm not saying these weren't prostitutes, but we'd often play in the mid-80s at the Roxy with my
Yeah.
band, and they had Manhattans across the road, and on the Sunday sessions at the Roxy, they'd always have the wet T-shirt competition. The band got to wet the girl, and what would happen
Yeah.
was the strippers from Manhattans back then, or whatever it was called back then, they would come over and enter the wet T-shirt competition.
Sure.
and we'd all be talking to backstage, and we all got on just like really good friends because we were all in the entertainment game. It was just,
Yep.
it wasn't like, it wasn't sleazy or anything. It was just, we
Yeah.
were all doing our thing, and there was a real similarity between the musicians and the strippers doing their thing. I've had a lot of cops say to me that, or not a lot, numerous cops say to me that the difference often between the alpha males as a police officer and the alpha male as a crook, they're very similar people that just kind of went down different roads to where they got
Yeah.
to. Did you find
Yeah.
that at all?
Yeah, mate. I one of the things that I've spoken to a lot of ex-undercover cops, both here and in the States and in the UK, um, through various means. And the thing we all struggle with is the sense of betrayal that you meet someone that you actually quite like
Yeah,
and has similar, absolutely right, similar approaches, similar attitudes, similar drive, I suppose,
yeah,
but they're crooks and you're not.
yeah,
And you know full well that the time you spend socializing with him, and I tried not to socialize when I was buying a lot of heroin because I hated him anyway. But sometimes I'd have to be in a bit of a social circle. And I'd sit there and go, so this guy, Nick, I actually quite like him, but affable dude, has a laugh, shared comedy interests, whatever. And knowing full well I was going to betray you and send you to jail.
yeah,
And and that's really something that's difficult to navigate, because anybody who's not a total sociopath will have some connection with others. And when you've got that connection with others and your whole job is to ruin their world, that can be tough to deal with, particularly, you know, as you said, alpha males, alpha males.
yeah. Mate, a lot of this stuff you do deal with in your first book, correct? If I remember correct.
Yeah, true. Yep. Yep.
And I had that one. I haven't had your second book. I have to admit, I'm sorry about that, but I will look out for that one. Um, Mate, you moved from the undercover world. What made you switch from there to where you got into with the tactical work?
Mate, I realized that, 2 years of undercover wasn't doing anything for my career. And in those days, I was determined to be a lifelong cop. Didn't work out that way. And I just thought, oh, well, I've done 2 years. I've had fun. Now it's time to go back to the real world and, build a career, get promoted, etc. So left, went back to uniform for 6 months because we needed discipline, apparently, but correctly. So I was back, in uniform doing patrols and then applied for the criminal investigation branch and got that as a junior detective.
Was that a hard shift mentally, going back from being this rebel out in the street to being in uniform?
Yeah, spot
Mm,
on. So I had to have all my hair cut off and I didn't get it cut to regulation. I got in a bit of trouble for that from time to time. Um, but it was more, again, identity, mate. I had literally bought a half an ounce of heroin one afternoon by a bus situation, and the very next morning, my hair was cut off and I was in uniform sitting in a patrol car going, "Wow, this is different." Um, so I sort of had to relearn all of that. But the benefit of that was the undercover work, mate, was that I developed an understanding the world is not black and white,
yeah.
and it's just shades of grey. It's just shades of grey.
Did that
But
make you
had
a
I
better street cop?
I think it did, yeah, yeah.
Mm,
I had the ability to talk to people and I wouldn't, you know, statute of limitations is probably gone, but if I found someone with a joint or two, before I went undercover, they would have been in handcuffs in the back of the car.
yeah,
When I came out of undercover, nah, you're actually not a bad bloke. Let's just throw this shit away. So it just changed my attitude to people, and I found that I could actually talk genuinely to people and get information from the right type of person as well. Whereas I didn't really have that ability before I started. And the problem was, I realized pretty quickly that I missed the adrenaline and the fear. So, adrenaline and fear are blood brothers.
yeah,
Yeah. And adrenaline is just as addictive as heroin. And I missed it. As much as I was scared, pretty much most jobs that I went into as a UC,
yeah.
I missed that feeling.
You thrived
So
on it.
yeah, I did. Yeah. Yeah. And that led to some issues later in my life, I'm sure. But so I needed a rush, and the tactical response group, or as it was called then, the emergency squad, was this bunch of blokes who were pretty much part time, who trained with the army, trained with automatic weapons, and trained in crashing into houses and dealing with domestic sieges and high risk
A
jobs with
part-time?
bad guys. Yeah, we were part time. We trained 4 days a month. and we were just on call, basically. If they could find you and a job was on, they'd do the this is before pagers and mobile phones even.
Mm.
So they'd just ring your house. "Is Keith around?" "No, he's out somewhere." "All right, he's at such and such a pub." Ring the pub. "Keith, thanks. Are you sober enough to come into a job?" And actually, "No, mate, I've had a few too many beers, bugger." So it was really hit and miss. Um, but it gave me the training and the jobs that we do gave me that rush and that adrenaline feed that I needed. So I did that for, God, I was part-time there for probably 4 years, I guess.
So how'd that work? You're part-time there, so did you still do the street cop stuff or
Yeah, I was a detective. So, I worked in the drug squad, break and enter squad, then went to a divisional area in Taringa. So I
Right.
did all that was my normal job.
Right, gotcha.
But, if say, for instance, there was a high-risk raid that had to be done on an armed robber, and there's a lot of armed robberies in those days, they'd call us into the office and go, "Right, we're gonna do this job, Thursday morning,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah," brief us, and we'd go and do the job and then go back to work. Um and it was okay. But about 4 years into that, I think, there was a change of attitude from those in charge. They decided they needed a full-time tactical group. Um, so I was sent away to New South Wales, Bandiana, so Albury-Wodonga, at a Bandiana Army base to do a bomb disposal course because part of the tactical response then was bomb disposal. And I said, "Yep, I'll go and do that because I could see that was just yet another qualification that would push me into a full-time job when it
And
was
something that could
available."
save your life as well.
Exactly right. Because the interesting thing about dismantling bombs, mate, is you gotta learn how to make 'em. So that was the fun part. Um, but then, not long after that, the boss called me in after the other thing we used to do was do a 2-week training camp at the Land Warfare Centre in Penungra, which is Mount Tamborine. It's an army base where everyone who went to Vietnam was trained. So jungle warfare, close quarter battle, all of that stuff. And around that time, the Special Air Service were flying around the country training the state tactical groups. So it was leading up to the Commonwealth Games. I think that all started. So this is all great. So I'm living this great life. And the boss called me in and said, "Look, are you interested in coming full time?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, where do I sign up?" So I was happy to move from being a detective into the full-time tactical response world. Yeah. So then I was sent to Perth to do a 4-week or a 2-week initially and stayed there for another 2 weeks training course with the Special Air Service, which was a police tactical group instructors course. So over there learning how to instruct in counter-terrorist work, all that fun shit. We're shooting thousands of rounds, we're throwing in stun grenades, we're smashing in windows and all that stuff that any young bloke would just love.
The boys that would have been
Um,
hard at work at Bondi yesterday, I presume.
See, I understand how the tactical world works, not their specific ins and outs, but I certainly saw some things that I went, that's Tactical Operations Unit, they call it in Sydney. Mm. And they raided the houses after the shootings. So all that was great. The problem that happened that sent me down the road to a spiral was not long after I'd come back from doing the training course with the SAS. We were tasked with an operation to raid a house to capture, uh, I won't mention his name, but Queensland's number one most wanted, an armed robber, a vicious piece of work. And I think he was about number 5 on the Australian most wanted list. Cut a long story short, he was living in this house with a woman and their 2 kids. Um, and we were tasked to go in and do the job. The plan that myself and another guy put together involved the use of tear gas, stun grenades or flashbangs to give us the opportunity or the best element of surprise and overwhelming force. And when you use those distractions, then you've got a better chance of no shot being fired. That's what it's all about. Get in there nice and hard and quick.
Mhm.
Nobody dies. It's all good. Unfortunately, that operation order came back from those in charge. And even though the person who denied who did what I'm about to say is dead, I'm not going to use his name either because all respect to the family. But the instruction came back that we weren't allowed to use tear gas or flash grenades. And then we
Why?
had this.
Did they give a reason for that?
It was the first week of the Fitzgerald inquiry, and And there's 2 things here. We were told when to go in and raid the house, which we'd never been told before. We always ran our own operations. It was, the first day of the Fitzgerald inquiry. The then police commissioner was in the witness box, and it was looking pretty bad. All this stuff was coming out, and I think those in charge wanted a headline to take attention away from the inquiry. Secondly, I think it just came down to a bit of stupidity. Rather than ask what flash grenades were, I think the person in charge assumed that they were fragmentation grenades that the army uses.
Right.
And rather than ask, he just went, "No." Um, Tear gas permission was refused because there were 2 kids in the house. Again, we knew what we were doing, so my plan was to fire tear gas into the bedroom where the offender lived, and the 2 children were in a bedroom at the back of the house. But anyway, we weren't allowed to use them. And we had bullet-resistant vests that were pretty old, and were only ever designed to stop a shotgun and a handgun. Even a
Mhm.
.22 rifle bullet would have gone straight through them. So one of the guys, Peter Kidd, who was in the team that I put together. So I planned the operational part of it. So I put together 2 teams, and Pete was number 1 through the door. He was also the equipment officer, and he had put a big report in probably 3 months before to upgrade our ballistic vest capability, and it got knocked back because of budget. So you can probably see what's coming here. So we were forced to go in with the tactics and equipment that I knew were necessary but weren't allowed to have. So we crashed in through the door. The offender had changed the direction that it opened from inwards to outwards, which slowed us up by probably 3 seconds. And we moved through the house. He knew exactly we were coming. Because I couldn't use flash grenades or tear gas, I'd instructed a team to be under his bedroom window. And when they heard the first hammer smash on the back door, they were to throw a ladder through his bedroom window to make him think that they were coming up that ladder. Within half a second, he was out of bed and he fired 2 shots through the skirting board towards them, where they would have been climbing up a ladder. So it was on. Um, so we made our way through the house, went to the bedroom, and he opened fire on us. And Peter was shot 5 times. Steve, who was with me as my flatmate at the time and one of the best friends, was shot in the stomach once. The rounds all went through Pete's vest because there was just the vest was not fit for purpose. And then 2 of us shot the offender, and the offender died at the scene, and that's okay. I never lost a microsecond sleep over that. But I was with Pete in the corner of that room when he was in incredible pain and blood everywhere and blood all over my gloves and that sort of stuff, and waited until the ambulance arrived and took both he and Steve away. And he died that morning, about an hour and a half later. And I was just shocked. I was just, I now know it's survivor guilt, but I remember I don't remember what happened after I was told. For about 2 hours, I was just in total shock, disbelief, numbness, all of that. And the homicide squad came and collected us, took us into police headquarters and interviewed us because there'd been a police shooting, as they should. So had the interview, and they were great. They were supportive. But then and bless them, the only way they could figure out how to deal with our trauma was to take us upstairs to the police club, which was a licensed bar, and get us hammered.
Mhm.
So took us upstairs, bought us beer, got us pissed, drove me home. I walked into the house and had a shower and went back to the office that night where we got on the piss again. That was the thing, it was the numbing effect of alcohol was the way police dealt with shit in those days. And that from that time on, I was a mess. I was an absolute emotional wreck with clear PTSD, but no
But
one knew what
can I ask a
PTSD was.
question? Before you
Mm,
said earlier on that the crook knew you were coming?
mm, because we'd actually had to smash the door in.
Right.
So if we'd
So it's not like
utilized
it's
my
been leaked to him that you were coming, it was
no,
just
no,
the
no, no, no.
sorry. Okay.
Oh, his wife said later that he'd seen a couple of surveillance guys go past, and he was a pretty attuned guy. He was on the run. He'd escaped from Long Bay about 7 years before. Prolific armed robber, ex-army, so he was a good shot. And he just a lot of crooks have a sixth sense. It's bizarre, but he just had a sixth sense. And beside the bed, he had a police scanner, had a rifle that he used on us. He had a double barrel shotgun in some PVC piping. He had a shotgun under a coffee table that was sawn off, sitting under a coffee table in brackets, pointing towards the front door. So if someone had come in and gone, "I'm Detective Sergeant Bloggs, I need to talk to you," he would have been sitting at the coffee table and shot him. Just a piece of shit. And
But so
so no,
having you were
go.
saying also, so just a few questions coming back over what you said.
You're right.
You had you had your plan, things got knocked back about that plan, and it was the first day of the Fitzgerald inquiry, which we all know around that. Was it a sense that it kinda happened because of political interference that stopped you from doing your job properly? Was there any sense of that?
Yeah. I still hold that belief all these years later that
Well, that
those
would
in
add to the
charge.
bitterness, wouldn't it? That would have added to the pain a
Oh
lot.
God, yeah, yeah. It's like it's moral injury. I've learned about moral injury in the last 12 months. And moral injury is a sense of betrayal that goes against your moral compass, and that's exactly what it was. I still hold the belief that those in charge of the police force wanted, as I said, a headline to take attention away from the Fitzgerald inquiry. They didn't want a headline that said police use excessive force. So they went, oh, they're not going to use grenades. They're not going to use tear gas. They'll be fine. Um, and they got the headline they weren't expecting, which was police officer killed in the line of duty. And Steve survived, thank God. He still carries a bullet about a millimeter from his spine. And the rifle that this guy was using on us was a 223 caliber, so military grade caliber. This is before Port Arthur, so you could get those sort of rifles from Kmart.
Wow.
Um, and mate, after that, I just went downhill. Probably 6 weeks after that, we were told, the other operator and I were told there was a contract on our lives from Sydney, and the response from the police force was giving us permission to carry our guns off duty, which we did. That was it. And so I carried this thing with me off duty for 2 years. But about 6 or 8 weeks after this job had happened, I was sitting at home, and my first wife, I was living with her. She worked in the advertising field, and she was at some work dinner, and she was great. She was supportive, but neither of us knew what was going on with me. And I was drinking every night, just to sleep, hyper vigilant, all of that. And I was sitting there at home listening to a song by the Furies, called "The Green Fields of France," and I kept playing it over and over and over and over and over. Basically, racked up a round, put it in my mouth, and just thought, all I got to do is squeeze the trigger, and all the pain goes away. So I understand people who commit suicide. The thing that stopped me was a moment of clarity where I remembered I'd gone to a crime scene where a guy had shot himself, and when I was
Mm.
in uniform, with a high-powered rifle, 303 rifle, a military World War II rifle. And um, the brain matter and the blood spatter and all of that was a horrible scene. And I remember thinking, oh, if she comes home and sees that, that's going to ruin her life. So it wasn't about not killing myself. It was about not wanting to ruin her life. And I took the weapon out of my mouth and thought, holy fuck, I've got some problems. So the problem was there was no one to talk to. So no one knew about mental health. No one understood post-traumatic stress disorder. There was no counseling services. And to compound that, I loved my job, even though that horrible thing had happened. And I knew intuitively that if I went into work and said to the boss, "Look, I've had some problems, mate. I was thinking about topping myself last night," I'd be behind a desk instantly. So I didn't want to do that.
I had the same thing when I was talking to Todd McGuire about his situation. I said to him, when he was getting in that place undercover, did they give you the proper support within the department? He said, no. Basically, the feeling was, well, if you can't do the job, they just toss you aside and put someone else in there. Was
That's exactly right. Yeah.
That's insane.
That
I mean,
that was
people
insane.
people
Mm.
don't realize that, and so many. I think so many people leave the police department because of that lack of support. This is back in the 80s and 90s. Has it got better at all?
Oh, I know that there are systems in place now to provide counselling. I know that there's lip service paid to, our people matter. But I'm also told that there's toxicity in command in the police service in Queensland that is just abysmal.
Ah,
Um, and the other thing is that any cop I talk to, and I still talk to a lot of people that are current, they all have the opinion that if they voluntarily put their hand up and say, "I'm struggling mentally," then their career's marked, you know? It will be, "Oh, that's wonderful that you came forward," but then the corridor conversations will also happen to say, "You know, that Keith Banks, is a bit mad." So, no one wants
That
to
that
do it.
operation where Pete died, was that one that you got an award for that operation? Was that one of the ones?
Yeah, yeah, I got a medal, oh god, 7 years after, I think, a police valor medal. Um, and again, that was a long time afterwards, and not that medals are important, but it would have been good to have that happen earlier,
Yeah.
because what I understand about mental health and post-traumatic stress disorder is that the power of affirmation, if affirmation recognition happens early in that mental health space, then recovery is decades earlier, you know? So, and the reason that happened was I'd left the tactical world, I'd gone to the covert surveillance world and gone back to major crime. And, and I raced to a siege situation in in the center of the city in '93, I think. No, '92, where shots were fired in the MLC building, and I just thought, "Here we go. Massacre." Like bloody, Hoddle Street in Melbourne and various others. So I raced in there as a detective sergeant. I'd been running an operation with an undercover, so I had a pair of jeans for polo shirt and whatever, and raced up the stairs, and I won't go through the whole ins and outs of it, but essentially raced up the stairs with the intention to shoot this bloke if I had to. And, popped my head around the corner and saw this guy sitting, back against the wall, long beard, black unruly hair, pretty overweight, and, with a rifle across his lap and army webbing in front of him and a box. I didn't see what was in the box, but, I just popped around and said, "Whoa, Jesus, let's calm down here. Let's, how can we sort this out, blah, blah, blah." And he simply said, I'll never forget it. He said, "If you don't put that gun down, I'll blow this whole fucking place up and you with it." I went, "Ooh," and I looked at, sort of looked over the lip of the box. It's about
Mm.
2 meters away. It's full of gelignite. I went, "Oh, no." So I gave him a gun to another uniformed cop who was sort of beside me and around the corner, who stayed with me through the whole hour and a half. And I went in there and I sat with this guy and talked to him for an hour and a half about what can we do to resolve this. I was not a trained negotiator. I was quite the opposite, but I'd seen negotiators work. So just established a bit of a connection and then spoke with him, and it transpired over an hour and a half. He was a Vietnam veteran,
Mhm.
completely disaffected, clearly suffering from something. And he started talking to me when he trusted me after a while. He started talking to me about dreams, nightmares, alcohol, anger. And I'm sitting there thinking, fuck, I've got all that. Wow. And so I started talking to him about that a little bit. And it just, and eventually he surrendered everything and came out with me after he produced a hand grenade and pulled a pin out and threatened to blow us up.
Mm.
That's another part. Um, that's in the book, by the way, if anybody wants to read that.
Yeah.
It's not
I'll put
not
the
all doom and gloom. There's some
I don't
there's some amusing parts.
I'll put the
Um,
links into the to where your book is too, mate. I'll put links up
yeah,
so
thanks,
I'll
mate.
put
But thanks, Nick. But that was just a bit of a shameless marketing plug. But
no,
what
that's what it's about,
what
mate. We wanna let people know your story, and if they wanna this is great information you're sharing, but if you wanna hear the in-depth details, you gotta grab the book.
Yeah, yeah. So walked out with me. Um, he ended up being charged. I can't remember who he was charged with, but he went to jail for 6 years. Um, he died in 2002 in Chinchilla, I think, in
Mhm.
Queensland. And the lifestyle was, going to do him in anyway.
Yeah.
But that just started
Did
me.
you have a follow-up connection with him at all afterwards?
No, I thought about it. Then I thought, I'm a copper after all, and I could probably intuitively realize that if I did that, I might get caught up in his world,
Yeah.
and I knew that I had my own shit to deal with. Um, and not long after that, I was being headhunted by the corporate world, and I just got disgruntled with the way the police force was going, and even though I'd been promoted after the Fitzgerald inquiry, so my slate was clean. They went through it with a fine tooth comb. I just I just thought I didn't fit the mold anymore. Um, I'd been told by a superintendent, my mates I've told them who it was, and they've all gone, "Yeah, that figures." I've been told by a superintendent that, I needed to change my attitude, that, I was too supportive of my team, that I questioned authority too much, I was too much of a rebel, And by that time, I'd had another medal as well. So, um, and the medals and the publicity didn't do me any good. And I remember thinking, "You arrogant prick." And I left that meeting and walked out. As I was walking out, I said, "Just be careful in here, sir. Those paper cuts can be really bad." Um, and and that's and I just realized, God, that the job I wanted to do forever, I just didn't fit the mold, and maybe I never did. And so I took up a corporate role and left the cops, and that was one of the hardest things I ever did. Um, Went into the corporate world, mate. Did an MBA that the company I went to paid for, which was great. So I started learning some new stuff, but for the next, I reckon 30, 25 years, I guess, just still struggled. Still struggled with drinking way too much, with some flashbacks, with anger, um, never being settled. Had a family, never, ever violent towards my family, but I was short tempered. If something fell out of the fridge when I opened it, I'd just lose my shit. And I knew that I was being a bit of a prick, but I just thought, oh well, that's just who I am. Years later, 2019, I was in a meeting with a bunch of public servants in Melbourne, and one of these guys just had something about him. Thought, this guy's not your classic public servant. So we're having a tea break, and I just said, "Oh, what'd you do before this?" And he said, "I was in the army." I went, "Oh." And I ask every veteran that I come across, "Did you serve overseas, and how are you going?" And he said, "Yeah, I did 2 tours of Afghanistan." He said, "How am I going?" Oh, some days shit, most of the days are good. And he'd served with the SAS, and so we're chatting about stuff. And as I'm chatting with him, he's fishing in his wallet, and he pulled out a business card, and he said, "Mate, this is someone you need to talk to." And I took the card. I was a psychiatrist. And I remember I said to him, "Shit, does it show that much?" He said, "Oh, fuck." He said, "It's written all over your face, brother." So made an appointment, went to see her, and that was the first time since 1987, the shooting, that I was diagnosed with chronic PTSD, anxiety, and probably depression. And and the benefit of that was, and this is what I shout this message from the rooftops. The benefit of that was I knew that I no longer thought that I was imagining it. I no longer thought that I was just an angry guy. I no longer thought that it was a personality flaw. It actually is a post-traumatic injury, which becomes a disorder if it lasts, I think the definition is if it lasts for more than 6 to 8 weeks, it's a disorder. Um, so I had all of that. So then I just said to my shrink, "Okay, what do we do?" And for the next year, saw her initially twice a month, and then it petered out to once a month, and now I haven't seen her for probably 6 months. We just went through how the brain functions, how trauma affects the brain, you know, what you can do to work through overcoming it. And the other thing, since the books were published, I'm in a network now of returned veterans, great people who are like-minded about the conversation of mental health. I've done a lot of research. I've done a lot of work. As I said earlier, I've just learnt what moral injury is in the last 12 months. Okay, there's 3 types. I ticked them all. And knowledge is incredibly beneficial. And the other thing I've learnt, mate, is because those of us who are affected by trauma to this level have massive amounts of cortisol running through our brain. Cortisol is good in short versions or short doses. Excuse me. Cortisol is good in short doses because it's part of that whole adrenaline fight flight stuff. When it stays in your brain, that's where the damage happens. So, because our brain is wired for hypervigilance and massive amounts of cortisol, one of the ways to get through that or get over that or recover from that is to rewire your brain to one of gratitude. It sounds a bit, I don't know, orange robe sitting on the beach at sunset shit, but it's not. It's actually, the power of journaling, for instance. So I don't do it much anymore, but I spent quite a bit of time before I'd go to sleep. I had a little notepad in my bedside drawer. I'd write down 3 things I was grateful for, 3 things that went well. Yep. And if I couldn't write anything down, that pattern comes out when you go back through your notes and go, "Okay, couldn't write anything down. What was going on in my life then? Oh, maybe it's an anniversary that brought some memories back. Maybe it's because I wasn't exercising at that time. Maybe it's because I was being sleepless, whatever. And you can see patterns. And what that does over time is it rewires your brain away from hypervigilance, anxiety, um, and depression to be grateful. And if you're grateful for life, your resilience level increases. So when shit happens, you've actually wired your brain to have a level of resilience you didn't have before. Now, that's one technique. There are many others. Mindfulness, meditation, exercise, you know,
I
diet.
think out of the gratefulness too, it's interesting when you get to that point where you realize the miracle of life we have, the great experiences we have, and just being able to see and actually take everything in, and how
Yeah,
we let ourselves get caught up in. Sure, you've got these major issues that happen, cause the big problems, but then we wrap up so many little problems and make them seem like big problems when really they're things we should just let go.
yeah,
And we take on all this extra baggage on top of the things that you should be working on.
yeah,
And I think one of my big things is constantly trying to say to people, don't worry about things that really aren't worth worrying about. They're only a worrying point because it's something you want to do to yourself. So if we can get
yeah,
rid of all of that, which is what I think you're saying through gratefulness, it's like focusing more on the positives around you than the little things around you that
yeah,
are negatives. And then, okay, then it still may have the bigger issues like your situation with Pete dying in that situation.
sure.
That's a much bigger problem and that needs a different approach. But if you can get all those other smaller things out of your life that don't need to stress you, it kind of
Mm.
makes it feel a bit easier to manage, I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good summary, mate. When you were talking there, I was thinking about because I've read a lot of stuff. I've read Gabor Mate, who's a, Canadian psychologist, The Myth of Normal. I've read a great book. It was written by an ex cop um, in the US who became a psychologist. Um, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, and various others, and The Resilient Shield by Dan Pronk, I know, he's a good friend.
Mhm.
Um, and all of that stuff I've just absorbed, and it's not all stuff that works for me. I just throw that away, but there's other stuff that does. So Stephen King, the horror novelist, has 2 rules in life, and Stephen King was an alcoholic and a massive drug addict till he turned his life around. And, his 2 rules of life are number 1, don't sweat the small shit.
Yep.
Number 2, it's all small shit. And I read that and thought, "Oh, there's a guy who gets it, I reckon." In other words, hey, you can't change shit. It's like Stephen Covey, you respond to things, you control how you respond to things and your circle of influence, all of that. And it all sounds a bit weird and stuff and a bit hippie-ish. Um, but it worked for me. I was in the depths of depression for years.
People who are struggling and, guys and gals out there who hopefully share this around and see your chat. Um, what support can you give them through what you do? Is it through your books or have you got different
Um
speeches you've made or things or directions?
Yeah, I've been on a lot of podcasts since I've started this journey, and some have been with military veterans, some have been with police, some have been with people like you who aren't connected to either,
Mhm.
actually haven't served in either. Um, and I talk about this in some fair detail, similar stories, but other parts of it, so people can listen to that. I think um, if I put the whole seeming like a or feeling like a wanker thing aside, I think if people read my books and see the recovery, after some pretty severe trauma, because I did stuff that normal coppers don't do, thank God. Thank God for them. And people see the recovery is possible, that's great. Um, I had Channel 9 did a documentary on my story, a two-part doco. You can find it on 9 now, called Australian Crime Stories: The Investigators. I think it's season 1, Australian Crime Stories: The Investigators. They did a two-part doco, and it's been replayed a lot. And um, what I love, if that's the right word, is that when they are replayed, I get a large amount of DMs through Instagram and a large amount of PMs through Facebook
Yeah.
from people I'll never meet who talk about the impact it's had on them, hearing my story and that they don't feel alone. And that was the big thing for me, Nick. All those years, I felt alone. I felt like I was the only one in the world going through this because I didn't know what I didn't know. So maybe if people want to watch that, that's okay. It's not my best camera angle, uh, but I think the message is, and I say this to everybody I speak with about mental health, is you're not. And I can't say it enough. You're not alone. There are thousands of us who are feeling exactly like you are, and thousands of us who've gotten through it. Yeah.
I think
Um,
that's the brings us full circle in a way to where we started talking about what happened at Bondi yesterday. And as people are feeling stressed out and a bit traumatized by all of that, don't be afraid to talk to people around you about it. Like to
yeah.
actually reach out and vocal. You don't have to have it all inside you and build up in anger or whatever else. Have a chat, reach out to people, and that's the old thing of Aussie mateship. We need to step up at this point and really make the most of it.
Mate, you know, it's about in your circle of friends, your tribe, because we all have tribes,
Hmm.
and the tribes differ. Yours are musos, you'll have family, you'll have other tribes you belong to. In those tribes, there'll be someone that you trust,
Yeah.
and ring them up and say, "Hey, mate, have you got 10 minutes for me?" Meet them, have a coffee, or do it on the phone, whatever, and say, "Look, I'm struggling with this." If they're a true friend, and they will be, they'll come and see you, or they'll give you time to talk. And it's important that you don't feel judged, that you don't feel that you can't say that you're struggling with it. It's like when we spoke before you hit the record button. I was struggling yesterday with the events in Bondi.
Yeah.
And I've seen more than most, and I was still struggling with it. So, and I had friends ring me, which was cool as. Um, if you're the person that someone calls to say, "Hey, can I spend 10 minutes with you? I need to talk to you," just shut up and let them talk. Don't try to solve their problems. Don't try to give them advice, because some often men particularly, we just need someone to listen to us without judgment and get it off our chest. And if that does happen to you, don't then just wash your hands and go, "Okay, I've been a good guy. I've listened to Nick for, 10 minutes. All good. I'm a good human." Follow up, give it a week, do it once a week, follow up and say, "Hey, how's life going for you?" I could bang on about this for hours too, but I think "Are you okay" day is a good idea. I don't particularly like it because 2 reasons. It's a closed question,
Mhm.
and secondly, it's only important 1 day a year.
Exactly.
So, I say to people, and my friends and I talk weekly because I live here, they live up there. Um, and my way of chatting is, "Hey, how's life going for you?"
Mm.
Not, "Are you okay?" "How's life going for you?" "Oh, it's been pretty shitty." "Oh, tell me, mate, anything I can do?"
And
Let
often
them
too,
speak.
if you think a friend's going through something, you don't have to. You can get around it a little bit sideways. Like during the whole COVID thing, we had a real issue in our music industry with people really, suffering, and I was actually getting quite vocal online about what was happening just in my little echo chamber. And but
Yeah.
one of the reasons I did that was I'd get people respond to me, and it gave me an indication on who was struggling and who needed help, and you could give them a call and have a chat to them and all that type of stuff. So even if you've
Yeah.
got your friends and you might put a post up about, just saying something about what's going on, and someone responds to it in a way that you feel like isn't quite right, well, then give them a call, follow up, and just
Yeah.
say, "You're doing okay." Use those social media things as well to 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 not to go out there and blatantly ask the question, but just be aware of what's going on around you.
Yeah, absolutely. If we think back to the days before social media, you'd be aware of your mates, wouldn't you?
Yep.
You'd pick up something that wasn't quite
Well, that
right.
was one of the old things about the old public bar days too, where guys would go and have drinks in the pub
Mm.
bar and have a chat to each other. They had that bit
Yeah.
of that. We have lost a lot of that now. It's all become
Yeah.
this socialing online these days, which really kind of disconnects people rather than really joins people together, I think, in many ways.
Yeah.
But
Agreed, mate. And Nick, the power of a phone call is immeasurable,
absolutely.
you
Mate,
know.
thank you so much for this chat and your time. I really appreciate it.
That's all right.
I know you've got a lamb cooking that you've got to go and work on and get to. Um, but mate, I'll put the links up for where people can catch your books. And
Yeah.
anything else that we haven't covered that you think you would like to bring up, or
Mate, I think we pretty much covered it all. I'd just like to close by saying, just reaffirming again that if anyone's listening who's struggling, just remember you're not alone. You're not alone. Man or woman, you're not alone. Um, People have hidden this for way too long, and I just want to normalize it as much as I can. You know, just to have people say, "Well, I'm struggling a bit." That's great. I've got the flu, I've got a cold, I'm not feeling too flash mentally.
Yeah,
Let's try and normalize it as best we can.
great. Mate, thank you for all you do, mate, all the work you've done over your career and what you're doing now with helping people. And thanks for taking the time to have a chat to little old me.
No, mate, it's great to see you again, even if it is online.
It is, mate, it really is. All the best down in Melbourne. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, Nick. Cheers.
Mate, stay there, mate. I'll just stop the recording here.